Hello. I'm Naomi Lindenfeld. I've been a potter for 35 years, and I'm the ceramics teacher at the Putney School in Vermont. I first met my friend Christy Herbert when we both worked at the Brattleboro Clay Works, a longtime collective studio. I and others there appreciated her insight that Christy was able to offer as to why someone might be approaching their clay work in a particular way. This came from her experience of working with people who have learning disabilities. Christy has been teaching at Landmark College since 1986, just down the road from where I teach in Putney. Landmark is known for being the best college in the country for working with students who learn differently. For some years, Christy taught education and graduate courses in learning disabilities, all the while doing ceramics on the side. After going back to school to earn an MFA, she founded the ceramics program at Landmark College. She is also the coordinator of the college's Bachelor in Studio Arts program, which allows students to concentrate in ceramics. Having a background in both ceramics and learning differences led her to want to give this lecture on what she considers to be the key information in working with students who may struggle with having different approaches to the way they learn. I would like to now introduce Christy Herbert.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Of course, as a teacher, I chose to be able to move around. Thanks. I'm really honored to be here and hope that in the very short time that I have, I can at least pique your interest in some of the key ideas that I'm going to be talking about. And happy to talk with people afterwards. And I have a stack of my cards sitting up on the desk if you want to grab one afterwards and email me and continue our conversations. So let me get started. Also, I wanted to mention that I uploaded 3 handouts on the app that I think are critical that go with this presentation, so you can print those out. Here are some pictures of some of my wonderful students at Landmark. This lecture is going to really hone in on 3 major questions. And the first one is, what are some of the kind of hidden demands that our clay classrooms and studios make on people? Some of the things that when you walk into a clay classroom that many of us might take for granted are easy to navigate, but which may not be. The second question is, okay, if some of those hidden demands are difficult to navigate, why? What might be behind them? What might explain some of the kind of puzzling behaviors that we encounter? And lastly, and probably why most of you are here, I assume, is, so what can we do about it? What are some ways we can think about making our classrooms really accessible, successful? And so I'm going to now actually demonstrate to you one of the techniques that I'll be talking about in a few minutes, which is I'm going to give you an advance organizer for this lecture so you have a visual of what's coming up. First of all, I've separated the 3 sort of major areas of challenges within a clay classroom into 3 spheres: social demands, organizational demands, and procedural demands. And then I'm going to be talking about some of what might explain difficulties in these areas, keeping in mind that everybody struggles with all of these things at some point. Labels are somewhat, diagnostic categories are limited. They only point us in good directions for our practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about autism spectrum challenges, ADHD and executive functioning, and I had hoped, but I had to throw this off the cart as I traveled cross country and kept practicing and trying to time this right. I had hoped to talk about this phenomenon of what we call in the field of learning disabilities co-occurring conditions. So often people, it's really hard to untangle the challenges anybody faces because which comes first, crippling anxiety or ADHD? Which comes first, OCD and perfectionism or mild autism spectrum? So in the end, that's a really important thing to look at and could constitute its own lecture in its own right, and certainly is all the more salient now in our world where it's a very anxiety-provoking world, and clay is becoming more and more soothing in the face of that. And language-based challenges, of course, cut across all kinds of challenges. And then there's what I've branded the lack of affinity with clay. And in the words of the great academic David Sedaris, he writes about his experience in art school, and he says, "Frustrated with drawing, I switched to the printmaking department, where I overturned great buckets of ink. After trying my hand at sculpture, I attempted pottery. During class critiques, the teacher would lift my latest project from the table, and I'd watch her arm muscles strain and tighten against the weight. With their thick, clumsy bases, my mugs weighed in at close to 5 pounds each. The color was muddy and the lips rough and uninviting. I gave my mother a matching set for Christmas, and she accepted them as graciously as possible, announcing that they would make the perfect pet bowls. The mugs were set on the kitchen floor and remained there until the cat chipped a tooth and went on a hunger strike." Have to thank my daughter for passing that on to me. She's like, "Mom, you gotta get some humor in there." I'm like, "Thank you." So let me begin now. I've given you a kind of advance organizer, and I want to do another sort of overture remark, which is, given the busy beehive of our studios and all of us working, the teachers and so on, working to the best of our abilities to be inclusive, what can we do that can benefit everyone? And I want to, how many of you, raise your hand if you're familiar with the concept of universal design or universal instructional design. This is a pretty big kind of trend in education, but for those of you who don't know about it, the concept of, the best way that I like to describe it is the concept of universal design came out of waves of disability and people's rights movements from the starting in the 70s, disability rights, moving into civil rights and women's and LGBTQ and so on. So in that first wave, with kind of activism often comes legislation. And the legislation that came out of the disability rights movement led to the federal law that required buildings to be handicapped accessible. So as builders and architects struggled, and everybody struggled to make the buildings more accessible, they found that, I'm going to ask everyone here, because you're a lot of artists here, visualize in your mind a wheelchair ramp that's been added on to a building on the side that's really ugly. Picturing it? Pressure treated wood. Okay, that ramp works. It's compliant, right? It gets people into the building, but it's really ugly, and it's cheap, very important, but more importantly, it separates people, right? They're coming in a different entrance. So what architects found was, if they have the budget and design those features into the building in a way that isn't separate, everybody can benefit. That's universal design. So now I want you to visualize you have an unlimited budget to build a graduated walkway that's beautifully landscaped that comes into a building. Can you picture that? Maybe coming in on two sides. That is beautiful and seamless and doesn't separate people. And more importantly, and this is a key point, everybody at some point is going to need that graduated walkway. Most people are going to have trouble with the stairs. They're going to sprain an ankle or something is going to happen. So the concept of universal design, instructional design, which then educators quickly adopted, is the same idea. So really the heart and soul of my lecture today is, how can we build those beautiful, seamless on-ramps into our studios and classrooms? And how can we cultivate a mindset that doesn't separate people or that doesn't engage in, well, I have to know exactly who's coming up and why that ramp before I can work with them. We don't have to label everybody. We can really just create a practice that's inclusive. So that's sort of the philosophical underpinning of some of the principles I'm going to talk about. And then the caveats, of course, with labels. Wow, to say that I get to teach you about the least you should know about ADHD or autism spectrum in 5 minutes is a little bit arrogant, but there's a lot out there to learn. I'm just trying to put it into my layperson, the most accessible language that I can. So let's get started, and we're going to look at the hidden, a lot of these things I'm talking about today, they're hidden disabilities, and that makes it all the harder. If someone's at your classroom door in a wheelchair and they're struggling to get in or on crutches, you're going to run and open the door, right? So I want you to think about that. So the social demands, here are some pictures. I have one of my students here of the Landmark College studio, and just to kind of emphasize just how social a studio is, preaching to the choir here. So what are some of the social demands that we wouldn't normally think about? Knowing when, how, and with whom to interact. Raise your hand if you have students who have a lot of difficulty with that. I call it the only living person in the room phenomenon, right? And especially with Clay, right? Oh my God, I need you right now, and I'm not aware that there's a lot of other people that need you as well. Reading social cues, huge. How many of you are professional potters and you're trying to meet a deadline and someone in your studio is interrupting you and you feel like you're sending off every cue on the planet to leave you alone and they're not paying attention to it? Anyone have that experience? All right, great. Being aware of one's impact on others. That's our lifelong effort here, all of us. But again, if it's part of an issue, a kind of hidden problem. And then regulating emotions is huge. So when you're mixed into that whole pot of all that social, kind of social interaction, regulating emotions is integrally linked. So now let me talk about the least you should know about autism spectrum challenges. The first thing is, of course, is that it's a spectrum. And, we, in the field of learning disabilities, we use something called the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and these labels kind of come and go and get legislated, and they're all about funding that people get, and based on the legal definitions, right? So previously, there was a separate category called Asperger's at the mild end. In its most recent iteration, it's now all autism spectrum disorders are considered to be on a really long spectrum, from mild on one end, which is highly functioning, and a lot of times people on that end of the continuum might get labels of quirky or eccentric, etc., to the severe end where they may need an assistant to function in daily life. So some of the hallmarks, of course, of autism spectrum challenges are difficulty with reading emotional social cues and interacting socially. And on a positive note, having specific and deep interests and potentially obsessions, which I think is just an incredible gift in the Clay classroom oftentimes, if you can get people to shift into a new assignment. And then a tendency towards sensory emotional overload. So now let me jump into some of the kind of universal instructional design principles. And the first one that I want to talk about is the grandmother of all the principles. And as with any practice, if you're doing like yoga or meditation or martial arts or throwing on the wheel, you can spend decades and decades and decades perfecting that, right? Same with these. They appear so simple, but if you don't do them right, they're those ugly on-ramps. So when the idea of being direct, explicit, and concise with all key communications takes practice and thought. So when you hear the word directions, embedded in there is the word direct. So the idea is, how can I communicate with people who are struggling in the studio or classroom in a non-punitive, non-patronizing way, right? So that's what this does. So you name what needs to happen in a really friendly, neutral way. Can you move over there? Can you move your stuff over there? Being explicit means being precise, and that means not talking around or indirectly or using sarcasm. That may well not be read by someone on the autism spectrum at all, and in fact misread. And I watch it all the time. And Naomi was alluding to Brattleboro Clayworks that we were members of, and for 10 years I would watch people all the time trying to communicate something indirectly, with nonverbal, and all kinds of frustration ensued. And then concise, I want to emphasize the idea that people learn from success, they don't learn from failure. It's really typical when working with someone who's struggling to say, let's look back, let's unpack what happened and see if we can learn from that. That's really not very helpful. I'm going to just put that right out there. What's helpful is learning from success and moving ahead. Because if you've experienced a lot of shame and lack of success and a lot of well-intentioned talking heads telling you, let's look at this, let's go back, and what would you do differently, it becomes neutral. It doesn't really matter after a while. So what I'm advocating for here is move ahead, like get into success, get into action. And that'll relate really well to when we talk about ADHD as well. Like get things moving, experience some success. Second principle I want to talk to, it sounds a little bit formal here, but establish key social interaction protocols. And that's actually, again, one of those really hard, elegant planks to build because it feels so weird and unnatural. In a college or a graduate classroom or a 10th, 11th, 12th grade, it still can feel awkward to say, hey, here, let's talk together about some of what the acceptable rules are. We could probably write a treatise on the role of music in creating conflicts in ceramics classrooms and so on. Of course, now we have earbuds, but so that's a really helpful thing to do. Now, when we think about sensory overload and the need for getting a little space from people breathing around you and feeling overloaded, if there's a way for you to create a really designated quiet work zone versus open talking zone, instead of everybody working together, I really do believe we overemphasize group work in our culture. And I live with a teacher who works in public schools, and we always fight about that. Because if that is the very thing that makes someone struggle, I think it's like giving them the breathing room. At where I teach, I actually have lots of pieces of canvas that I move over and create that space. And also defining how and from whom and when students should get assistance. Another really clear kind of do it up front, don't do it afterwards. Do it up front. Like I'm going to be sitting, like I'll say to my students, I'm going to be sitting at the front of in my desk at the front of the classroom to conference with you, and I don't want anyone to come up until I'll cue you to come up, or I'll walk around and work with you. So you're being explicit in whatever way you need to figure that out in your classroom. The next principle is the idea of providing really structured opportunities and/or spaces for privacy and emotional cooling off. It's really validating that you as the teacher or fellow studio mate want to just give people the space to get their amygdala, their cortisol kind of down and get them back in. So a really key way of doing that is to schedule breaks into your, and to do that in a way where you're not leaving the students hanging on when it's going to be. It's kind of on you to be doing that. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Again, providing solo work areas. At the Brattleboro Clayworks, we have a whole separate room with a little wheel, and we have a little private office space with a little IKEA chair. So we actually created little solo spaces. It's really important for that emotional regulation and overload. Providing choice in classroom assignments. And here's a really big one that I use a ton in my ceramics classes, and that's, and these are all on the handout on the app, by the way. All this is on there, okay? So what I do, along the same lines of when I'm starting a class, I'll say, here's where the gender-neutral bathrooms are. This is signaling a lot to my students about where I stand in terms of inclusion. And at the same time, I'll say, some of you at some point are going to feel completely overloaded and like you want to throw some clay across the room. So what I want you to do, and this is of course a college classroom, is I want you to feel free to walk out of the classroom and really practice emotional regulation. We actually use that language at Landmark, but like, go out, do what you need to do to get in quickly. Don't disappear, but you don't need to talk to me. And I'm not gonna, when I can see they're overloaded, that's the last time in the world as a teacher that you should say, okay, I want you to sit down and breathe with me and let's talk this through. No, brain chemistry is such, let people get that cooling down. Okay, so now I want to move into the other two areas of demand that I outlined at the beginning of this lecture, and that's organizational and procedural demands. Wow, when you walk into a clay classroom or a studio, there is a lot to understand and know, right? Depending on how well equipped it is. And there is a lot of mess to make. So, I love this picture. It's of Landmark Studio. It's like an Edward Gorey print because you've got a student throwing in the front, you've got a student on the left glazing, and then in the back there's a student that looks like he's about to pull his hair out. So, it's like, wow, there's a lot going on, and it's a big kitchen there. You got to be really, the oven's hot. We got to be really thoughtful about working well together. Likewise, here's one of my students, and we've got laptops and phones and Fitbits and clothes and all kinds of drinks and all kinds of stuff to manage and organize. So let me just talk. I think we could probably do a fun brainstorm here if we had more time about what the organizational demands are in the clay studio. I just tried to keep this brief, so I'm going to put down some of the more salient ones. But knowing where to putting things away is huge. And putting them in the right place, cleaning up, containing one's own mess and equipment, like really maintaining your boundaries around what equipment is yours and what isn't, and along the same line, keeping one's space organized, clean. Again, this is so self-evident, all of the organizational demands that I've just put up some of them. The procedural demands of the clay classroom are legion. So depending on how well equipped your studio is, there's a lot of equipment to use, right? And to track. And then there's a lot of key ceramic processes to follow, from reclaiming clay to glazing and on and on and on, right? So all of those imply the need to be able to follow some really clear steps. And then I'm going to just throw in here for the fun of it, because it so aligns with ADHD, is being able to break things down into steps and march in an orderly fashion toward meeting deadlines. Very difficult for many people. And along the same lines as timing, meeting deadlines, and knowing when things are happening. So the first principle, I'm just going to check the time here a minute. All right. So the least you should know about ADHD and executive functioning is, I like to define ADHD as difficulty with goal-oriented behavior. Just not getting the same reward system for finishing something that someone with a different brain might have. So knowing what and how to do something, but not being able to get it done. So that therein lies the reason why it doesn't help to lecture. It's akin to having an incredibly well-stocked kitchen without recipes. I love that analogy. And implicated in ADHD are executive functioning problems, and that's that whole gamut from getting started, activating, prioritizing, regulating emotions along the way, not getting distracted, sustaining focus when you hit some roadblocks, to finishing. That's a long gauntlet, isn't it? And it's very easy to either hyper-focus down or get distracted into something else if you have ADHD. And it also implies a difficulty with transitioning. And finally, perfectionism is such an interesting issue for here as well, one I could lecture on in its own right. So here's a cousin to the first grandmother principle that I gave you. And that is, I want everybody to think about if you could set up your classroom or your studio in a way where if someone walked in, they had no instruction whatsoever in how to use the studio or what was going on. What are all of the visual cues that you could place in there that would help them find their way and navigate? Huge planks, right? Typically, teachers will be like, here, I'm going to show you guys how to use a slab roller. I'm going to watch you and help you use a slab roller. That's it, right? You can go look at a YouTube video if you forget about it. But actually, what you need to do is get some really clear signage up there that you've worked on in that Zen way that I referred to, where you have those steps listed really clearly and they're up. And the next principle, again, these are all on that handout, is I coined the word many years ago teaching workshops of this idea of posting maps around the studio in the classroom. Same idea, visual maps about where things go and where to go. So, and here's the first map that we use all the time at Landmark is this idea of using an advanced organizer. Highly recommend the book called The Skillful Teacher. Which this comes from. And advanced organizers basically put the agenda up on the board, and nothing could be more boring than a teacher reading an agenda, right? What this is really different. Remember the visual that I gave you with all the Venn? I'm hoping that when you saw that, not only did it organize you about what was going to happen, I hope if you're into this topic, it got you excited. So that's what's really important about an advanced organizer. It helps people transition into this is what we're doing and get psyched. So you can create maps that tell people where they're going, where things belong. You can post calendars. In the field of universal instructional design, if you Google that, you'll probably quickly come upon multiple means of representation, multiple means of assessment, multiple means of this and that. So you want to have multiple entry ramps into your curriculum and into your classroom. So I have a website, I have physical handouts, I have handouts up on the wall, I have them everywhere for every possible which way when someone gets lost. Here it is, here's a big bulletin board in my classroom with the firing schedule and key dates and different calendars for different courses. Here, this is the Ceramics 1 and 2 courses. And here's a little plastic holder in the wall right near one of the kilns with a map that shows where when we glaze at the college, we put the glazes out all over this. We have 15 glazes all over the studio in a set place. And this shows that shows my work-study students, one of whom is here. Previous work study students, where to set up the glazes, and it shows everybody where to go. And I'll end on this picture of a lecture at the college, a demo. With time, I think I did it, right? Yay! Thank you so much. Happy to